Thank you everyone for coming along to today's talk, The PACE Trial on Trial with David Tuller. David is a Senior Fellow in Public Health and Journalism at the Center for Global Public Health, University of California, Berkeley. David is currently in Australia on a mission to debunk the PACE trial, a study done in the UK which found graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioural therapy to be effective treatments for myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome, and which supported the position that ME/CFS patients need to exercise their way out of deconditioning and that the illness is psychiatric in nature. This study has been cited as the main reason why the Australian guidelines for ME/CFS recommend graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavioural therapy. David is currently on an Australian tour where he is meeting with healthcare professionals, ministers and government officials talking about the PACE trial and the impact it's having on ME/CFS patients. And we thank him for being here today. Would you please give him a warm welcome?
So, okay, well, this is me. The title has sort of changed. I'm mainly talking about the PACE trial. And so basically, everybody's here a patient or a carer, right? Is anybody here not a patient or a carer of a patient? You're not. Okay. But everybody else pretty much is. And has everybody heard of the PACE trial? Anybody not heard of the PACE trial? Okay. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So I wanted to just point out my conflicts of interest because there's been sort of recently exchanges on Twitter especially about that I have conflicts of interest. And I'm putting 100, actually I think it's 1,022. That's the number of people who the number of donations I got last year in my crowdfunding campaign. And currently I'm doing a crowdfunding campaign and I have 600 something. So however many donations I have at the end, that'll be how many conflicts of interest I have. So the argument being made by one of the PACE authors is that I have conflicts of interest because I'm getting paid by patients to say what patients want me to say. I suppose that's true in one sense, and I think my counter-argument is that I was saying this long before I was getting paid by anybody to say it, and I spent 3 years saying it and reporting on it and writing about it before I asked anybody to pay me anything. So my feeling is that the cause and effect is a little bit wrong. They're positing that I have a conflicts of interest, and again, it is a conflict of interest because anytime, patients have a vested interest in me saying something, and I believe something, and I'm saying it. But the argument would be that I'm getting paid, therefore I'm saying things, when the argument really is the other way around. I've been saying things for 3 years. Therefore, patients are supporting me because of what I had already said before anybody paid me anything. So that's my response to the concerns that I have a conflict of interest, and I would also say that they pale besides the conflict of interest that the PACE authors themselves have, which they did not declare to patients, which we'll discuss. I got interested in this not because I have a personal vested interest, but because I had a friend who got sick about 25 years ago. I always sort of had an interest in it. When there was some evidence or some science that suggested it might be a mouse retrovirus called XMRV or a related mouse retrovirus. That was in 2011. At that time, I was doing a lot of freelance work for the New York Times. I was also in graduate school at Berkeley in public health. And so I did a whole batch of stories about that situation. That seems to have turned out to be about lab contamination, and that was not borne out by subsequent studies. However, during that, the PACE trial got published, and I got interested in it, especially after reading sort of patient commentaries and about all the problems with the PACE trial. So I decided I would look into it, and I just was more and more horrified as I looked more into it, and as I showed it to my colleagues at Berkeley who were smarter than me and who were epidemiologists and biostatisticians, which I'm not. Uniformly they all were just completely appalled at the lack of integrity in the study, at the data manipulation, and at many of the other flaws that I subsequently wrote about. So I may not have gotten, financial, money from it. Also, the idea about conflicts of interest. If anybody, had nobody would spend their time investigating this for financial gain, or for professional enhancement. This, nobody, editors are not haven't been interested. Nobody was paying for it. So the idea that, this has been a big, thing that I have done for financial gain in some way, or that I'm sort of making a lot of money from this, is sort of ridiculous. I think in the end, I'm very glad to have done it. It's been an amazing project. It's still, a privilege to be working on it. But I've done it because I'm horrified by the science, and I'm horrified by the claims being made by the PACE authors about their really bad science and what that has meant for patients. So that's really been my motivation. Primarily. And it's also been fascinating. If it was a really boring project, I probably wouldn't have been able to stick with it this long, but it's also fascinating because you're watching people who are basically claiming, up is down and black is white and red is blue and, here is, far is near, and they're just the opposite of what their science actually proved. So I find that kind of fascinating from a psychological perspective. And so for me, I think, what do I push here? Oh, okay. So for me, that's changed here. What do I do to get it up there? Technical help? I just pushed that.
Let's use the page up and the page down.
Oh, okay. So that hasn't moved that though, or maybe.
Slideshow mode.
Oh, because it's not in slideshow mode. Sorry, technical difficulties.
Let's see if I can. Okay, so then I'll work on the sync.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, so this one?
Page up and page down.
Page up and page down.
Page up, page down.
Okay. Okay. I'm very technologically challenged, so I can't do anything. So basically, why have I kept doing this? And I'm sorry, I'm also really bad at PowerPoint because of my technological challenges, and so it's a lot of just text. So I know some of you, that will be difficult to read. I'll try to explain as much as I can. So basically, the thing that's interesting to me is, how can a study that in which people could be recovered, have met outcome thresholds at baseline, how did it even find its way into the literature? Why is it still there? Why was it peer-reviewed and approved? And why, after it's been documented that people can be recovered at baseline on both of their primary outcomes, which are self-reported physical function and self-reported fatigue, why is it still in the literature? And how can does it have a legitimate place in what we call science? I would say no. Again, is there a place in science for a study in which participants were simultaneously disabled or recovered or within normal range in the Lancet on a measure? If you have, you can't have HIV and not have HIV simultaneously on a blood test. It's just ridiculous. And any study that contains such an anomaly or stupefying paradox, as I said here, it really has no place in it being called science and no place in literature. And the other thing is, why have patients been defamed for pointing out this basic flaw or this basic black hole in the middle of the study? And why is it controversial, apparently, for me to be saying this? It's kind of preposterous. And I've never been able to understand that still. I still don't understand that, and that kind of mystery has kept me going because I just I really don't get it. It's incomprehensible and just ridiculous. So I think this is the next one. Oh, I went backwards. Okay, so basically, I'm starting in 1955 with the history, but really it can go back to other outbreaks that happened in Los Angeles in the 30s and elsewhere around the world. But this was the one at the Royal Free Hospital in London that about a couple hundred nurses, mainly nurses, probably, I forget the exact number, somewhere I think between 200 and 300, came down with what clearly looked to people like an infectious disease. It had a resemblance to sort of polio. They thought it might be in the same category of virus, which is an enterovirus. it was called after that by Melvin Ramsey, benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. Nobody uses the term benign anymore. Benign tends to mean not malignant, not like a tumor, not malignant. It doesn't kill you, but we know it's not benign because people are very, very disabled. WHO characterized it as a neurological disorder in 1969. Two psychiatrists, or maybe psychiatrists in training, I'm not sure, in 1970 wrote a paper where they reinterpreted the royal free outbreak as mass hysteria. They had basically two arguments. They didn't interview anybody, even though they could have, because people were still obviously alive. They basically, their two arguments were nobody identified a pathogen, which is a problem. Nobody identified a particular virus. And the other data point was that most of the people who got sick were women. So obviously it was a case of mass hysteria if most of the people who got sick were women, as we know. So in the 1988, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, which is the main public health agency in the U.S., investigated an outbreak in Lake Tahoe, which is between California and Nevada, and they called it chronic fatigue syndrome. They considered different names, but they couldn't really find anything. They couldn't find a specific pathogen. It seemed to be related to Epstein-Barr virus, but nobody really knew. And they called it chronic fatigue syndrome after what they presumed was the main symptom, which is that people were tired. Now, we all know that that's a terrible name for all the reasons I don't have to go into, but just the fact that every article is illustrated with the woman on her hand on her head looking very tired, is a problem. And you all understand, you all know, I think, that this name makes everybody think they understand it, and they say, oh, I did a whole, 3 loads of laundry today, I'm tired too, or I walked 10 miles, so I'm really tired also, or they make jokes, about fatigue and so on. And so it's really a misnomer as well, because the fatigue, as you all know, it's not just being tired, it's sort of this paralytic exhaustion that people feel after they do too much. And so really the main symptom is not fatigue, but it's really post-exertional malaise or whatever else one might want to call it. There are other names for it. In 1989, Simon Wesley and other researchers proposed their hypothesis about deconditioning and false illness beliefs. So the idea being that people got an infectious illness, got over it, and were still thinking that they were sick. Why were they thinking they were sick? Well, a couple of reasons. One, they would be deconditioned because they'd spent a month in bed with glandular fever or whatever. Then they try to do something, and of course they're deconditioned, which is a serious issue. And then they feel bad because they're deconditioned, and so they decide they actually still have an ongoing illness, and so that leads to their false illness beliefs. One of the reasons why the hypothesis is that people think this is that there's a group of people running around saying there's a disease called ME or a disease called chronic fatigue syndrome, and so that convinces these people who don't have an illness that they actually do still have an illness. So that's their theory. They proposed 2 therapies, graded exercise therapy, as a way of reconditioning people, because if the main thing is deconditioning, and again, deconditioning is a serious, serious deconditioning is very serious. You get muscle issues and muscle atrophy and sleep dysregulation, and depression sets in, and they posited this vicious cycle. So you need to be either reconditioned, so you need to sort of ramp up your graded exercise, so you increase your exercise slowly or rapidly, as the case would be, to recondition yourselves. Or you need cognitive behavior therapy of a particular kind, not regular cognitive behavior therapy, but cognitive behavior therapy specifically to alleviate you of your delusion or your false illness belief or dysfunctional cognition that you actually have an organic illness that prevents you from doing stuff. So that's the basis of their cognitive behavior therapy. It's not the same kind of cognitive behavior therapy you would get if you it might be recommended if you had MS or if you had cancer or if you had something that everybody recognized or you just had a bad divorce or whatever it is. Cognitive behavior therapy is indicated for people who are having life challenges that they want to sort of help get control over and sort of adjust to and figure out how to deal with. And that's very appropriate if you have a major illness to have cognitive behavior therapy that helps you cope with your illness, but not cognitive behavior therapy that helps alleviate you of the false cognition that you have an illness. So they got permission to do the PACE trial in 2003. Eventually it cost £5 million for the UK government agencies, including the Department of Welfare and Pension. And they tested CBT and GET. They started in 2005. The first results in 2011 in Lancet. So if something's in the Lancet, it means it's true. It means it's very authoritative science and everybody believes it. The 2013 recovery results were published in Psychological Medicine, and then I don't have it on there, but in 2015 they published their long-term recovery results. So those were the three main papers. They have a lot of other papers coming out of the PACE trial, like 15, but those three, this and the third one in 2015, were the three main ones. Okay, so one of the issues with this illness that makes it very difficult is that there are more than 20 case definitions. The one that the PACE authors used primarily was the Oxford criteria that was developed by one of the PACE authors, and that's basically 6 months of unexplained fatigue, unexplained debilitating fatigue. That becomes kind of a proxy for, if that's how you're defining it, then you're likely to get a very heterogeneous sample, because there's going to be a lot of people in there with some fatiguing something that really isn't identified, but is not a specific illness or one of the cluster of illnesses that we're calling CFS or ME, whichever name you use. In 1994, the CDC, these are just a few of them. So the 1994 one's been the most common one up until recently. It requires 6 months of unexplained debilitating fatigue and 4 of 8 other symptoms. But one of those 8 other symptoms is post-exertional malaise, but you can be identified as having chronic fatigue syndrome under the CDC definition without having post-exertional malaise, because there's 8 symptoms to sort of pick and choose from. In 2004, the NICE guidance in the UK required 6 months of fatigue plus 1 of 10 other symptoms. It did require post-exertional malaise as part of the fatigue itself, so that was positive. The 2011 one is the International Consensus Criteria. It's based on one from 2003 called the Canadian Consensus Criteria. They're all slightly different, but they do both require post-exertional malaise. They call it post-exertion neuroimmune exhaustion, which may be a more accurate term, and then other symptoms like a Chinese menu, one from this category, one from that category, trying to capture the various core symptoms. And finally, the Institute of Medicine in the US in 2015 issued a big report looking at all the literature, which required sort of the fatigue, and then post-exertional malaise, which they called exertion intolerance, unrefreshing sleep, which as many of you know is a core symptom, and some sort of neurological issue. So they said either or both, cognitive dysfunction or orthostatic intolerance. So those suggest a neurological complication. So they just wanted to make sure that people had some neurological dysfunction going on as part of the definition. There's problems with all of these definitions, but I'm not going to really go into them here. Okay. Oh, I went backwards. Whoops, sorry. Oh, okay. So there were 2 reports actually in 2015 from the US. One was from the Institute of Medicine, the other was from the National Institutes of Health. So basically they both were based on reviews of many, many studies. There were many thousands of studies. And they both basically found, sort of similar to what the IOM said, that it's a serious chronic complex and multi-system disease. And they specifically used the word disease to sort of identify it, to suggest that it was organic and physiological in nature, and dramatically limits activities. So this implicitly rejected the idea that it was psychiatric, depressive or anxiety disorder, or functional neurological or somatization disorder, or that it's caused by deconditioning and false illness beliefs. So a somatization disorder is what they used to call conversion disorder, same as functional neurological disorder. So those are disorders in which people kind of have psychological distress, and they somatize, or they express that distress in bodily symptoms that are sort of unexplained. So that would be often fibromyalgia would be falling under that, irritable bowel syndrome, restless leg syndrome, Gulf War syndrome, which wasn't much of a problem here. I don't know if you had Gulf War syndrome, but we had a lot in the US after the 90s Gulf War, the first Gulf War in 1991. Where people came back and very impaired, and that was also treated as a psychiatric condition. So the Institute of Medicine renamed the illness systemic exertion intolerance disease, which nobody, SAID, I don't know how to pronounce it, nobody has adopted that name, but the good thing that they did was they took out fatigue as the core center of that name and put in exertion intolerance, also not a great term, but basically they put post-exertional malaise or neuroimmune exhaustion or whatever you want to call it at the center of the disease as the core symptom. And so that reframing, I think, has been helpful to be able to cite. The National Institute of Health report basically made similar findings and also suggested that the Oxford criteria, which is the criteria that the PACE trial used and with 6 months of fatigue, is harmful for research and should be retired. And they thought it was harmful because all of the case definitions, because they're symptom-based, will have a heterogeneous sample when you're doing, if you define people by that. We don't have a blood test, we don't have any kind of biological marker at this point. So anytime you define something by symptoms, you're gonna have people who have those symptoms but don't actually have the illness in question. In this case, it's probably not one illness, it's probably a cluster of related illnesses that people get, depending upon what's triggering it and so on, and their own makeup, genetic makeup. If you have a case definition that is just 6 months of fatigue with no other symptoms required, that is going to be even more heterogeneous and is going to make it much more difficult to find reliable data, because you're going to have a lot of people in there who probably have depressive and anxiety disorders that are undiagnosed and that do seem to benefit. To people with depression, people who have anxiety disorders are known to benefit from exercise and from psychotherapy. So it confuses the data, which is why the NIH said it was harmful for research. So I may do this mistakenly again. Oh, no, the wrong way again. Okay, I'll get it right by the end of the talk. So the PACE trial was billed as the definitive study of CBT and GET. So one of the main problems with the PACE trial, apart from all the other problems I'll talk about, is that it's an open label trial with subjective outcomes. And this is a problem with most of the studies in this particular field by colleagues of the PACE authors themselves and colleagues of theirs. Open label trial means that there's everybody knows what treatment they're getting, which, in a drug trial, one group gets the drug and one group gets the placebo or whatever the main pill that people get treated with, but nobody knows which one they're getting. And the doctors treating them also don't know which one they're getting, so that there's not any bias built into that. If you know that you're getting something that is supposed to be good for you, then you're more likely possibly to report that you feel better. So those were their the subjective outcomes. We'll maybe talk about the objective outcomes. All those measures failed to sort of support the subjective results of improvement in PACE, and therefore they dismissed them as irrelevant and didn't think it really mattered. They used the Oxford criteria, which, as we've said, sort of conflates chronic fatigue because it only focuses on fatigue as a symptom and the illness called ME, or the illness called CFS. Now, it probably doesn't matter if you actually think it is just an extended bad case of chronic fatigue. Then it doesn't matter if you lump everybody together. If you actually think there's a separate biological or physiologically based or pathophysiologically based entity that we're calling chronic fatigue, or a cluster of entities that we're calling chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, then it very much matters if you're just conflating that or lumping that in with people who just have chronic fatigue. That's why it's a little bit of a problem in Australia in particular, where I hear everybody, patients and doctors, talking about chronic fatigue instead of saying chronic fatigue syndrome, because you're sort of that contributes to the confusion that people without the illness have over, is it just chronic fatigue, or is there an illness called chronic fatigue syndrome? So I've been surprised here, because in the US, if you're a patient and you hear somebody say chronic fatigue, they're almost immediately corrected. I get corrected if it's in the headline, it says chronic fatigue. Here, everybody seems to have adopted chronic fatigue as the stand-in for chronic fatigue syndrome, and so it's understandable that clinicians and other people who are not aware very much of the illness get very confused. This trial had 641 participants, 4 trial arms, CBT, GET. APT is adaptive pacing therapy. It was their version of what would be pacing. And SMC is specialist medical care, by which they meant you saw a doctor 2 or 3 times or whatever.
What is GET again?
Oh, graded exercise therapy. So yeah, sorry. And CBT is cognitive behavior therapy. So these are the three principal investigators who I would say don't like me very much at this point. And again, the trial was based on the unproven theory that all symptoms are due to deconditioning because of patients' dysfunctional cognitions about their illness. No? Okay. So there are biomedical research efforts going on, and they've kind of increased a bit, which is good, in the last few years. In the US, some groups, in UK, there's some going on, in Australia, at the University of Melbourne and Griffiths, and I'm sure a few other places. Not all, again, most of this is not funded by the government, but is private funding. The theory that people seem to be working on is that people have an acute infection. So as you know, most people get it after some sort of acute infectious illness, often glandular fever, a bad flu, something else. And it triggers sort of a hyperimmune and hyperinflammatory response, which then continues after the apparent causative agent, whatever virus it is, has, you've gotten over that illness, but you're still left with this, these dysfunctions, particularly neurological functioning, and there seem to be mitochondrial inefficiencies in producing energy. So at a cellular level, in each cell, there's the mitochondria, and the mitochondria are where we produce energy. So we produce energy in the form of a chemical called ATP, and there seems to be something broken or inefficient in the ATP production cycle. So people literally, it seems, are not producing enough energy to do the things they need to do, or that they want to do. So it's most likely a spectrum of similar disorders. It seems to sometimes be triggered by environmental toxins. Mold seems to be a factor in cases. Some people report they get sick after surgery or anesthesia. And other physiological insults might trigger it or might be cofactors. So sometimes people have terrible car accidents, and maybe that's combined with a cold, or that's combined with terrible stress from other things, because stress is a physiological response that the body has. So there may be cofactors we don't exactly know yet. Some people insist it's only, and true ME is just if it's post-infectious, but again, it's sort of an open question, what exactly is causing this?
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Can I just take a copy of that on my camera?
I'm sorry?
Can I take a copy of that?
Yeah, anything. Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. I can
Okay.
email it to the group also. They have the PowerPoint, so anybody can get the PowerPoint. I have no proprietary anything on this, or I don't care to. Sorry. Okay, so this is where a lot of the CBT, GET, and they call themselves Biopsychosocial group. But really, the bio isn't really that much part of it. It's really psychosocial. So in UK, King's College London, Queen Mary University of London, Oxford, University of Bristol. In the Netherlands, they're doing it. In Australia, University of New South Wales, Professor Andrew Lloyd. He sort of does it he sort of has a slightly different idea of what it is and whether it, he maintains that he does believe it's a physiological disorder. I think of him sort of as doing what I would call soft Brexit instead of like hard Brexit. So he kind of has a slightly different perspective than from the PACE authors themselves. Okay, so this is very dense, but in brief, the PACE authors reported in the Lancet that they got improvement rates of around 60%. They also said twice as many got back to normal. Well, that was what was said at the press conference, twice as many got back to normal. Lancet commentary that accompanied, by their Dutch colleagues that accompanied the PACE trial, said that 30% met a strict criterion for recovery. Psychological medicine said that 22% recovered with these treatments. That was about 3 times as much as recovered from the other 2 treatment arms. So they said we had a 3 times as good a chance of getting better, recovering. Of course, when you look at the study, it actually just says by recovery we mean recovery from the current episode of illness. Well, that's not recovery, that's called remission, okay? If you're recovering from an episode of illness and you think the illness is still continuing, that's remission. They routinely distort the English language in a kind of clever way. So all the headlines about that study in the media were about recovery. Nobody read the fine print and saw that they really were talking just about remission. Since it's a fluctuating illness anyway, it's very possible that if there was any remission, it was spontaneous and had nothing to do with their treatments, but they called it recovery, and I think that was quite a deceptive thing to do. I published my sort of expose, I guess, my 15,000 word series on Virology Blog in October 2015. So Virology Blog is a science site hosted by Columbia microbiology professor. So he was a virologist, obviously, that's his area of interest, and he was interested because of the viral implications of this illness, that it's often triggered by a virus. So that got him interested, and he published my series. And I've kept writing on that blog. At the same month, the Lancet Psychiatry published their long-term follow-up and found that there were no long-term benefits from CBT and GET, but they managed to claim that their trial was a success anyway. In October 2015, Alan Matthews, who many of you know is a patient in Perth, from Perth, very heroically fought and got, so many patients filed freedom of information requests for data. The PACE authors had written a protocol for their study, which is what you're supposed to do, and you outline in a protocol everything that you promise to do. In exchange for what you promise, you get your funding, you get ethics permission, and so on. They changed everything about how they basically changed all their primary outcomes in terms of how they assessed whether people had gotten better and so on. But they didn't publish their original, what they would have originally gotten had they used their original promise measures that they promised to do. So patients were filing freedom of information requests. Many of them were getting rejected, or most of them as vexatious. And they were not able to get the data. So Alan appealed those decisions to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, which is the agency that decides these things, and he won. And that happened the same month. Then the PACE authors, or the more accurately Queen Mary University of London, appealed to the court system to sort of what's the tribunal level, and there was a tribunal hearing, and Alan wrote a really masterful brief for that. I was really in awe of his massive work that he did to prepare for that, and that was held in the spring of 2016. And then in August of 2016, the tribunal ordered the university to turn over the raw data. Their decision was really an affirmation of what Alan had done. The decision was really scathing in terms of just rebutting the arguments of the PACE authors about why they couldn't release data. And then the PACE team themselves tried to put the best face on it and published their revised improvement rates. After they did it according to their original methods, their improvement was around 20% as opposed to 60%. So it dropped by 2/3. They claimed improvements in the original report of 60% that got used to promote the trial and how good it was. It turns out that it was only 20%. They said this didn't matter. It still showed that the trial was effective. After that, a journal called Fatigue published recovery reanalysis of the recovery data and found that there was only a single digit, so below 10% for all 4 of the groups, and that there was no real difference between any of the groups in terms of recovery. Again, the PACE author said this doesn't matter. We'll talk more about that later. And then just last month, the journal called BMC Psychology published a full reanalysis of all 3 of the main findings, improvement, recovery, and long-term results, and found that basically they're all bogus. Everything that they had reported was if you look at the way they promised to do the analysis, they really had very poor results. Again, I was a co-author on that. Alan Matthews was a co-author on that, and a couple other patients. And then 2 academics, one from Berkeley, one from Columbia, and one from New Zealand, or a university University of Wellington. So basically, the conclusion is that the outcome switching, which is what is called when you change your outcome measures in a trial, it changed their null results, or basically their 0 results, so some of the results they did have better reports from the cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy groups, but those were really placebo results because people were told these treatments will make you better. And that's a problem. When you have a therapy, when people are told this therapy will make you better, people tend to report at the end that they feel better or that they feel like they got better. So you can't really take those into account. And so they made these changes and then got much better results that they could report. And it turns out there were no long-term benefits from the treatments because everybody at the end was all at the same level. Oops, again. Okay, so these were some of the expert responses. So one of the things, I want to say that I didn't really write anything that patients didn't already know. So what I was able to do was take sort of the reporting from patients who'd already analyzed the trial and had written letters and were doing commentaries, and I kind of collated it all into like a big journalism sort of readable thing that people could read. And I got it onto out of the academic literature and out of just the patient community and onto this science blog that other people read as opposed to just the patient community. And so what I was also able to do was to get academic colleagues at different universities to say really, really terrible things about the trial. So anybody who's done any reporting or really has worked in science, scientists don't want to get involved in politics. They don't want to get involved in criticize. They just want to do their work, and they don't want to criticize other people's work, especially unless they're immediately involved in a dispute with those people or they're really intimately engaged in that domain of research. They don't want to just go out and say things like, it's the height of clinical trial amateurism about studies that they're really not involved with. But this study is so bad that people were, after a little prodding, were happy to say things that indicated that they thought it was bad. It wasn't just me and crazy patients saying this. This was esteemed academics. So Bruce Levin is a biostatistician. That was one of my favorite quotes in my whole body of writing about this. Ron Davis is at Stanford. Some of you know he's a well-known geneticist. His son is very, very sick with this, pretty much comatose. I mean, basically is being tube-fed, and it's really a terrible situation. So Ron Davis is researching it now and desperately trying to find something. So he has a vested interest. He was shocked that The Lancet published it. Jonathan Edwards is a retired professor from University College London. He's been very active in sort of the effort now to kind of try to find good treatments, and also he's appalled by pace. Art Reingold is my department head. He's the head of epidemiology at Berkeley. He thought it was a mess and needed independent review. I've called it a piece of crap. I've called it a lot of other worse things, but for now we'll say it's a piece of crap. Carol Monaghan is an MP in Parliament in the UK. She held a hearing earlier this year on the PACE trial, and in the House of Commons she said it was one of the biggest medical scandals of the 21st century. I have had an exchange with her, and I said, even though this millennium's less than 20 years old, don't you think it's actually one of the biggest scandals of the millennium? So I don't think she would go that far because we don't know how many scandals there are going to be in the millennium or if the human species is even going to survive the millennium. But in event, that's what I think, personally. Oh, I got it right. Okay. So Michael Sharpe, one of the PACE authors, and Richard Horton, who is the Lancet editor, as soon as not long after the trial was published, were on Norman Swan's ABC show in Australia. And they said some sort of interesting things that really have not gotten the scrutiny that they deserve. So one thing that Michael Sharpe said was, we have a number needed to treat. That means, and that number needed to treat in epidemiology is how many people have to be treated in order to get a benefit from it, right? So in this case, the number needed to treat was, I think it's about 7 to get a clinically important treatment benefit with CBT and GET. That means that for 7 people treated, 1 gets better, 6, there's no apparent difference. That sort of contradicts some of the claims they were making in the PACE trial. The way he got that number, actually, I think is from the recovery statistic, but I'm not sure, because if you look, there was 22% recovered, and you always have to subtract the number who sort of recovered or got improved from the comparison treatment. So that was, in the comparison treatments, about 7% supposedly recovered. So if you take 7 from 22, you get 15%, and that's about 1 in 7, right? That's a pretty small number. It's certainly a small number to force everybody to get these treatments who want to get benefits, as happens in Australia. 1 in 7, if you had 1 in 2, that might be different. That meant 50% improved. 5% is not a huge number, so it doesn't seem warranted to force everybody to get that treatment. Then this other statement I was really astonished by. What this trial isn't able to answer is how much better are these treatments than really not having very much treatment at all. Well, that's what your trial was, your £5 million trial was designed to prove. if you can't say that after your trial, then it means your trial did not have very good results. So why are you running around promoting that this is an effective, these are effective treatments? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Very few people have asked him about that. I've tried to, but of course they won't talk to me. Richard Horton said the paper went through peer review very successfully. It's been through endless rounds of peer review and ethical review, so it's a very easy paper for us to publish. So, as you all know, papers go through peer review before they're published. That's supposed to be sort of an independent check on whether the study's any good. Now, we know that in this case of this trial, he says it went through endless rounds of peer review, but we also know that the Lancet published it on a fast track. So fast track to publication usually means a month, within a month or a few weeks, something like that. You fast track something usually because it's a new treatment and people are dying because they don't get this new treatment. So if you want to fast track it if it's going to have a big impact on treatment. In this case, or a big clinical impact. So it's a new drug that's saving lives, so you don't want to you want to fast track it perhaps because you'll save more lives that way. This paper really only was confirming what the NHS was already doing, what the authors had already said. So there's no particular reason why it should have been fast tracked. And certainly you can't do endless rounds of peer review when you're fast tracking something in publication. So I've tried to ask Richard Horton numerous times, how many endless rounds of peer review did the paper go through during your fast track process? And of course, he hasn't answered me. So this was my 15,000 word expose, which ran in October of 2015. I really appreciated that Vincent published it. He didn't vet it legally. I mean, I had a couple of lawyers read it before and made sure I was, on solid ground. As we know, they haven't sued me. So I would imagine that had I really had everything wrong, I would have had to make corrections, and then if I'd insisted that I didn't make corrections, they probably would have sued me. So, I took a legal risk. Vincent took a legal risk by publishing this, but he thought it was a good piece of work and looked at the trial and was like everybody else who looks at it, besides those in the biopsychosocial cabal, found it appalling in terms of its science and was happy to go with publishing this. So after my series ran, a couple of months later, because I knew Alan was preparing his brief for the tribunal, so he and I were in touch after that, and I put him in touch with a couple of the experts I spoke with, who I think wrote him letters, but then I thought, let's get a letter out to the Lancet and posted so he could use that in his brief. So we had a letter with 42 leading scientists and academics. I was glad that 5 of my colleagues from Berkeley signed on. And this was a line in the letter: such flaws have no place in published research. In other words, this trial really should never have existed in the first place, or at least been published. The experts demanded an independent investigation. Dr. Horton requested a letter for publication, and then the letter was rejected by the Lancet in a form letter. And when Vincent wrote to the Lancet and said, we were asked to submit this letter, we were told that they consulted with the PACE authors, who said there was nothing new, and therefore they weren't going to publish it. So the PACE authors got a veto power over our letter. Now, of course there was something new. Maybe the flaws were not new because patients had already written about the flaws, but the fact that 42 leading experts, many of whom had nothing to do with the trial in the first place, were saying this was a piece of garbage, that was very new. Before that, you'd only had patients and someone like Charles Shepard from the ME Association, so the doctors who had said those things were associated with advocacy work around the illness. You didn't have 42 people independently saying the same thing. You don't, and editors are not supposed to waste the time of 42 leading experts and ask them to submit a letter for publication if they're just going to reject it. So my feeling was that was just a stalling tactic, and it was really an egregious failure in terms of ethical conduct for your journal editor. Oh, wait, I didn't go over everything. Oh, okay, so yeah, in March, the following year, I orchestrated it along with a couple of advocates helping me, an open letter to Psychological Medicine, which had reported the recovery findings, and 101 people signed that, including me. I signed that one, and then 40 organizations, and that demand was to have that study retracted. Immediately, actually, I should say, as far as I remember. So these are 3 of the many, many, many problems in the PACE trial. I wrote 15,000 words and then tens of thousands of words afterwards, but I couldn't even touch everything that was wrong with the trial. So they had this outcome switching, which I'll explain a little more. They don't have informed consent, from my perspective, and they biased participants in all sorts of ways, but in particular with a newsletter that really is kind of a shocking. Anyway, it's sort of shocking. I'll explain that too. These other problems, that it was an open label trial relying on subjective outcomes, and the use of the Oxford criteria, which is the 6 months of fatigue criteria, that's bad science, but those are accepted in the literature, and so it's hard to say that those are grounds for retraction. They're just grounds for discrediting the study and not paying attention to it, but they can't really be called grounds for retraction. One of the things I want to say again about open labels and subjective outcomes, if you have a trial, it's very hard, you can't blind people to, or it's very hard to therapeutic intervention, recovery, to behavioral or psychotherapeutic interventions, because everybody's going to know if they're getting graded exercise therapy or if they're not. But what you can do is have some objective measures at the end so that are not necessarily influenced by people's knowledge of whether they got the treatment or not. So if you did have a blood test, if we had a biomarker, you could measure those things, and that would lend legitimacy to it. The problem with subjective outcomes is that they're subject to bias. So if you spend 6 months or 3 months giving people a treatment, like graded exercise therapy, and all the time as part of the treatment, you're telling people this has been shown to work, then at the end of 6 months, or whenever you ask them, people are more likely to say they feel better than the people who got treatments where they were not told, or were in this specialist medical care where they were not told it would make you better. It's not, you don't have to be brilliant to figure that out. So studies like this, which are used often in psychiatry and psychology, really, from my perspective, are really so rife with bias that you can't really tease out what's bias and what's an actual result. So I would gather that those of you who are parents would not allow your children to take a pharmaceutical or a powerful drug if it was based on a trial where everybody knew whether they had the placebo or the drug, and they were told the drug will make you better, and then at the end they had no objective findings, but all that they had was someone saying, yeah, I feel better. I don't think most people would allow their child, and especially if the objective measures didn't bear out what people said about how they felt. That's really not a good grounds for making everybody in the world who has this illness do these treatments. You really don't want to regulate treatments that way. Okay, so the outcome switching that they engaged in, they did this multiple ways, but I'm just going to focus on one as an example of, and this to me is the one that's the most incredible, and that anybody looking at the study should have never cited it and should have realized that this is a problem. So they had a questionnaire for physical function called the SF-36. So it's a scale from 0 to 100. 0 means you're just basically dead. 100 means you have imperfect health. Most people who are, even if you have a little bit of disability, would score 85, 90, 95. So when you look at that measure, this is sort of a normal bell curve where people are all clustered in the middle. When you do that one, most people are like this. So most people are clustered in the 90 to 100 thing. So they did what was appropriate. They decided that 65 or less was what you had to score on that measure to get into the trial. So that represents serious disability from their, and that's true. That would be serious disability. In the protocol, and so these are questions like, I don't know, but they're questions about physical function. Can you lift something? Can you climb the stairs? And then you say yes, no, or whatever. And each question is 5 points. So in the protocol, 75 or more was the level for improvement. And when they looked for recovery on that measure, 85 was what you needed to score to be considered recovered on that measure. Well, when they published The Lancet, they did something called a normal range, and they had lowered that to 60. So that meant that you could start at 65, get worse, score 60, and you'd still be considered within the normal range. So that's their outcome threshold. That changed into the recovery. They used the same statistics, and they called that recovery for physical function in psychological medicine. So that's a little easier to understand, recovery. So basically you could be recovered on that measure at 60, even though you were physically disabled if you scored 65. So anybody can tell that this is totally preposterous, right? You can't be recovered and disabled on the same time on a measure. It's just it's like, it's craziness, it's insanity. As it turned out, a patient filed a Freedom of Information request and found out that 13% of their participants were already within normal range or recovered on physical function at entry. So this makes no sense. Why were they in the trial in the first place if they weren't disabled enough to, it makes no sense. If 60s recovered, why were people with 65 in the trial? They obviously couldn't have been that disabled. If you can't lower your recovery thresholds to lower than the disability requirement for getting into the trial in the first place. You just can't do it. But they did. So why was this important fact not disclosed in any of the published papers? Now, anybody reading the papers could have seen theoretically that that was possible because they said this is the recovery thing and here's our entry criteria. Of course, they didn't point that out in detail, so nobody probably noticed it when they read, if they read it quickly, but that's what they did. And there's other outcome switching, but this is the most extreme and the one that really is kind of the most mind-boggling. So what were their answers for this? When I criticized them for this, what were their answers? Okay, so we changed outcome measures before seeing the results, so they were pre-specified. Okay, well, even if they didn't, what happens in an open label trial with subjective outcomes is that you don't need to look at your actual results to know which way the trends are going because they're subjective. You know, patients are saying, oh, I feel better or I don't feel better. You're getting feedback from the therapists that are doing it. So basically, they probably, I would say undoubtedly, but who knows? I suppose it's possible they didn't have any idea. But if you make a change like that, after you collect all your data, even if you haven't looked at your results, you cannot call it pre-specified. That's just, again, a distortion of the English language. Pre-specified actually means pre-specified. Pre means before, so pre-specified means before the trial begins. They didn't do that. They did it after the trial ended, or after they collected all their data, and so it wasn't pre-specified. Here's another excuse. We decided our original measures were too stringent. Well, that may be, but that's why you write a protocol, because you can't just change your, if you can decide after the fact that your measures are too stringent and you can change them, then why bother writing a protocol? Just do the study, and then after the fact, construct the outcome measures that you want that'll show the best results. That's not what you do in science, so it's sort of irrelevant that they decided after the fact. They spent 2 years writing their protocol. Why did they decide before? Why didn't they decide before what was the appropriate measure? They did what you cannot do in science. This was an interesting one. It doesn't matter that people were recovered on key variables because we had other recovery measures as well. So again, this is ridiculous. If you can't be recovered on any recovery measures, even if you have 6 other recovery measures. They had 4 recovery measures. Participants could be recovered on 2 of them at baseline. 13% were recovered on the physical function at baseline, and 3% were recovered for fatigue at baseline. You cannot do that in a trial. It's just preposterous. If you've done that, if that's the situation, your entire trial is rendered ridiculous and absurd and nonsensical and should never have been published. So the revised measures showed CBT best average results. So one of the things they did, which in their outcome switching, was that they changed what's called a rate or a percentage into a comparison of the mean. So if you say 50% of the participants got better, you also know that 50% didn't get better. So what doctors and clinicians want to know is how many people got better and how many people got worse. The average means that you average all the scores in the cognitive behavior therapy group in all 4 groups, and then you say, on average, people in the CBT and GET groups got, scored 2 points more than the average of those in the other groups. Well, that's an interesting finding, but the problem is, if all of our, everybody here, we pooled all of our salaries or whatever our income, and then we added Bill Gates into our group, right? Our income would be astronomical, right? But the average, and then you had another group that didn't have Bill Gates in it. Obviously, our group would be way, way, way higher in our average income. But that wouldn't tell us anything. We wouldn't know that one person was the outlier and had so much more, what we call an outlier, and was so much above all the others. When you have an average, you have no idea how many people got better or worse, because you don't know. We could have had 3 outliers who did phenomenally well. Everybody else did worse, but it makes your average higher. So doctors and patients are really interested in rates, like how many people got better, what percentage of people got better. They're much less interested in average results. Doctors want to know how many, if I give this to my patient, not on average will he or she do better, but how many patients got better, how many got worse. So this is sort of a stupid answer. And this is one of my favorite answers. They complained that the reanalyzers, like in our paper that was published last month, tweaked the outcomes to make the results look worse. Well, all the people reanalyzing the data did was untweak what they had tweaked. They tweaked their own measures into something better, and reanalyzers untweaked the unauthorized tweaking that they did, like for their recovery paper. So this is just a preposterous answer. I know I'm using the word preposterous a lot, but everything about this trial, or many things about this trial, are preposterous in terms of science. And okay, so they did not obtain informed consent. They had consent forms, but here's what happened. In the PACE trial protocol, again, you have to do what's in your protocol. You can't just change it because you don't like things. They promised to adhere to the Declaration of Helsinki. Now, the Declaration of Helsinki is an international human rights agreement that was developed after World War II and first published, I think, in early 60s to protect human subjects. Now, we all know why that was done, because of the Nazi and the concentration camp research and all that kind of stuff. So there was the world community felt we needed to have some international protocol about what's acceptable in human research. In 2005, and it has been revised over the years, so in 2005, when the PACE trial started consenting people for their study, the Declaration of Helsinki was very explicit about what had to be done to get informed consent. You have to tell participants about any possible conflicts of interest and any institutional affiliations. So any possible conflicts of interest is a pretty stringent requirement. It's much different from any conflicts of interest, right? It's any conflicts that might be conflicts, anything that might be a conflict of interest or that might give the appearance of a conflict of interest or that someone might think is a conflict of interest. Any possible conflicts of interest is fairly broad. The PACE principal investigators have spent decades, I would say, the three main ones, advising disability insurance companies that these rehabilitative therapies like CBT and GET are indicated for claimants who have ME or CFS. So I would say that that is any possible conflict of interest. It's also an institutional affiliation. They also have similar advisory capacities to government agencies in the UK. So those were also institutional affiliations that they did not disclose. They did not include these disclosures in their consent forms. So basically, I don't know if they probably didn't even maybe they read the Declaration of Helsinki, maybe they didn't. They may not have realized they were violating their own protocol, but they were. You can't make promises in your protocol and then just not do them because it's inconvenient or because you didn't notice it or whatever. We don't really know why they didn't do it. So what are their answers? Again, every answer they've given throughout this whole episode are all non-responsive. They say that they've addressed all the questions, but they have addressed all the questions. They just haven't actually given satisfactory answers, and it's very easy to poke holes in all their answers. But they keep saying that they answered everything. And those at the journals and those in the UK medical establishment are enabling them by continually agreeing with them that they've answered all questions. So we told the journals about our possible conflicts of interest. Well, you have to tell the journals. It's required to tell the journals. But the Declaration of Helsinki was not written to protect journal editors. It's written to protect participants in your trial. So the fact that you told journal editors is neither here, and journal readers is neither here nor there. It's completely irrelevant. Insurance companies were not involved in the study. Again, this is a non-response because the measure of conflict of interest is not whether somebody funded you. I mean, that's one measure. That's the potential conflict of interest that I have because I'm being funded at this point by patients in the community. But it's whether you have a vested interest in finding a certain result. And if you spend a lot of time telling insurance companies that GET and CBT are going to make patients better and that that's a way that they can avoid paying out benefits, then you certainly have a vested interest in coming up with those results in your study. So that's a non-answer. And then they said only 3 of 19 investigators did work for the insurance companies. So there were 19 named authors in PACE. And this, again, is irrelevant. So there actually were 4 that declared in the journals that declared possible conflicts of interest or these insurance company ties. So again, I don't see why that has anything to do with anything. So then you declared the 3 or the 4 that have insurance company ties. So I don't really see what they're giving answers that they think are good ones, or maybe they realize they're bad ones, but they've been accepted by the UK and academic and medical establishment for reasons that escape me. So this is the newsletter. They published a newsletter. They published several participant newsletters during the trial. And in this one, in December 2008, they still had about a third of the people that were that had not finished the trial, that were either just entering or were at some stage where they were still being assessed, going through the trial. So they included what you can't do, which were really glowing testimonials from participants who had finished the trial already and said things about how the therapy was excellent and it helped me tremendously, and the treatment, and found the treatment useful, and I'm so happy this treatment trial has changed my life, my sleeping. They also had congratulations from 10 Downing Street. Gordon Brown, I think, was at the time, and about how wonderful, how fantastic it was that they're doing this trial. And then they had the NICE guidance had been published the year before, and the NICE guidance had recommended CBT and GET and something called activity management based on the best available evidence. So in the newsletter, they told people that the best available evidence already showed that CBT and GET worked. So again, if you're a patient in the trial and you're getting GET and CBT, you're thinking, great, this is going to improve me. That's going to bias your findings, what they say. If you're in the other treatment arms, it's going to bias your findings in the other direction. What are their answers? The treatments were not mentioned. So these were the answers that they gave to me that we published on Virology Blog after my series ran. The treatment arms were not mentioned in testimonials, so there could have been no bias. So it's hard to know how to respond to such a claim. It's just totally ridiculous, because basically then you're biasing everybody in a positive direction, which is also bias, which is not really true, because you could tell that these were active treatment arms and not necessarily, they talked about the therapy. So the therapy is presumably one of the two therapies that they got. Well, they could have been the adaptive pacing therapy, but anyway, you can't bias everybody in your study in a positive direction and then claim that it's not biased. It's just ridiculous. The article about NICE in the newsletter mentioned not just CBT and GET, but activity management, which was the third treatment offered in PACE. So the statement in the newsletter could not have induced bias. Well, the third treatment was not called activity management, it was called adaptive pacing therapy, and the fact is they really are somewhat different, and it's really unclear why the PACE authors would argue that that was the third treatment offered in the trial, when in fact it wasn't. So if they may think it's the same thing, but somebody reading it is not going to know that activity management is the same as adaptive pacing therapy, so their argument is invalid. So this was one of my things that I showed this to my colleague, a biostats expert at Berkeley, and he looked at the newsletter. When I showed him, he said, you mean they published this? He couldn't really grasp it, like they published this during the trial, and I'm like, yeah. And he said, well, I guess there's no prohibition against publishing great testimonials, because it probably never occurred to anybody that anybody would try such a thing in their clinical trial. That was he couldn't believe it. And people don't do these things in clinical trials. You just can't do them. I don't know how many times I have to say this. Apparently a lot, because the PACE authors don't believe me, nor does the Lancet. So is PACE an example of research misconduct? The Medical Research Council, the first two things are the quotes from the Medical Research Council. So misrepresentation of data, for example, suppression of relevant findings and or data, or knowingly, recklessly, or by gross negligence presenting a flawed interpretation of data. Next, misrepresentation of interest, including failure to declare material interest either of the researcher or of the funders of the research. And the third is pretty much the same as the first one. That's from the National Institutes of Health in the US. So basically, I would argue that suppression of the fact that 13% of your participants were already recovered at baseline on one of your measures is certainly, it's certainly reckless. I don't know if I'd call it gross negligence or what I'd call it, but it's certainly misrepresentation of data from my perspective. Now, not declaring your interest to participants when you promised that you would, even without having promised that they would, I would say it's misrepresentation of interest, but certainly having promised that they would by agreeing that they would follow the Declaration of Helsinki and then not doing it is certainly failure to declare material interests. So I'm not the person who has to adjudicate whether something is research misconduct. That's not my function. But I would say it looks very much to me like research misconduct. So here are some of my conclusions. The reported PACE findings can't be taken at face value. And in fact, if you look at our paper that was published last month that Alan Matthews was also a co-author on, they basically proved in doing the trial that the treatments that they thought worked didn't work, right? So if they'd been honest researchers and had reported their original findings and not changed everything and and gotten findings that were better because they weakened all their outcome measures, they would have reported, hey, we didn't seem to get the findings that we expected, so I guess we were wrong, and these treatments don't really work, and we're really sorry we put everybody through this for the last 10 or 15 years. They didn't do that, but the trial actually proved, from my perspective, that these things don't work. In terms overall, if you look at a population, they're not going to work. That doesn't mean they don't work in individual cases. There may be some people who benefited from something or other. Certainly psychotherapy is helpful to people. Maybe not this particular kind, but if you have an intuitive cognitive behavior therapist, maybe they handled things better and people did feel a little better. But anyway, basically they proved that if you look at a population, they're not going to work. Possibly research misconduct. One could draw that conclusion according to the standard definitions. And they basically have no legitimate defenses. They've been arguing that patients criticizing them are anti-science, that they're like climate change deniers, and so on. And really, if you look at it, it's the PACE authors themselves who are the climate change deniers, or like climate change deniers, and who are denying basic and violating fundamental principles of science. Before I embarked on this, I really showed it to my colleagues at Berkeley, who were epidemiologists and biostatisticians, and they were uniformly appalled by the study, so I felt pretty confirmed that I was on the right track. And so now PACE is actually used at Berkeley in doctoral epidemiology classes as a terrific example of awful research and all the things that you can't do in clinical trials. So students get it to look at it and review for like a few weeks, and then they do a presentation to the class where they say how awful it is and all the things that are wrong with it. I think that's the only good use for the PACE trial at this point. I suppose epidemiology instructors should thank them, but unfortunately there's been a lot of harm done in the meantime. So, PACE, yeah. PACE is,
waiting for this.
I'm sorry?
I was waiting for this.
Oh, for the Cochrane Reviews?
Yes.
So basically, the Cochrane Reviews, Cochrane Collaborative, or I think now it's just called Cochrane, is a kind of volunteer organization based out of the UK. And they do kind of what they call systematic reviews or meta-analyses. So they take a lot of studies in a particular field, and then they combine them statistically to see, can they get, what do we see if we look at all the trials together and we combine all the data from all the trials? Because the bigger the trial is in general, if it's well conducted, the more robust the findings. So if you have 10 people in a sample, you're going to get squishy results. A lot of things can happen by chance. If you have 1,000 people, if the study is well conducted, you're going to get more results that are more reliable and valid. So Cochrane tries to combine results. And so one of the things that's happened is that because PACE is now recognized as pretty bad, I think generally people aren't really citing it anymore exactly the way they were. They're saying, well, it might not have been the best trial, but the studies have been, their findings have been confirmed by the Cochrane Reviews, so we're still believing in them. Well, okay, so there's a couple of problems with that argument. Cochrane, CFS in Cochrane is in the common mental health disorders section. So that means that the studies being reviewed are mainly psychiatrists and psychologists, by psychiatrists and psychologists. And who do you think is reviewing studies and doing the analyses in the common mental health disorders section? Well, probably psychologists and psychiatrists who were sort of often colleagues of the ones who did the studies. So that's a problem from the start. Since it's not a mental health disorder, it shouldn't be in that section, and that sort of presupposes what it is, which is a problem. The reviews do seem to support the PACE findings. One of the problems with that is that PACE is by far the largest study in Cochrane. Even if you take PACE out, you still seem to get the same results, similar results. But one of the issues is that if you look at the numbers of patients that they're including are largely, or majority of them are from Oxford criteria studies. So that means that they're from studies in which the case definition was 6 months of unexplained fatigue, and so that, or unexplained debilitating fatigue, so that again distorts your findings, because as we looked at before, that means that many of them probably have sort of undiagnosed depressive and other kinds of disorders that might benefit from these kinds of treatment. So you can't really take the Cochrane results seriously. Cochrane, there's rising pressure on Cochrane to actually deal with this issue from patients and now scientists. And they have another review of these studies that hasn't been published. It was supposed to be published last year, as far as we understand. It hasn't been published. That's a little suspicious. Not suspicious. It suggests that there's some things that they're concerned about. We do know that it has had some outside reviews that have not been good. And so that's the problem. So we don't know what's going to happen with Cochrane, but there's a lot of pressure on them. I haven't written much about Cochrane yet, but I need to, because Cochrane is still being used now to justify the PACE findings. Even when people say, well, PACE isn't so good. For example, I don't know if the Royal College of General Practitioners here has cited that, but other people have cited Cochrane in defense of these two therapies. So what is the responses to some of the responses? So in the US, under a lot of pressure, the CDC removed these two treatments from the recommendations for this illness. That happened last June, July. Now, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S., they also have concern about their reputation. They wouldn't have done this if they could in any way have defended the science, but they were being pounded for a couple of years now about the bad science, and they just, I guess, felt they had no way to defend the recommendations anymore. They had removed PACE mostly from their website. So for about a year, they had been claiming that these recommendations were just generic treatments for any kind of illness, and they were just being recommended for this. That was a very stupid statement, because obviously they were based on PACE and related studies, and so to claim they were generic, whatever, was not really an honest response. And so I feel they've been very bad public health people by not actually acknowledging that, hey, we screwed up, we cited a study that's clearly bogus. That's what they should do. That's what anybody in the field, public health or medical field, who has cited PACE should be doing. They should be apologizing to patients. NICE in the UK, the agency that does guidelines there, at first said they were going to reaffirm their 2007 guidance, and now, again, under sort of the weight of the scientific evidence, reversed themselves last August or September, I guess, and said they're pursuing a full update. We don't know how that's going to come out. It depends upon who they put on the panel. So now there's people are watching closely what they do to see who they put on the panel that's going to review all this. A Dutch advisory committee to the Health Council recommended recently that GET should not be used in the Netherlands. They gave kind of cognitive behavior therapy kind of a squishy 50-50, maybe it's okay. But again, part of the issue with cognitive behavior therapy is that it's difficult, because if it's regular cognitive behavior therapy, it can be helpful for patients, right? And that's also a problem with GET2. Patients are not against exercise or against movement, as far as I know. Patients want to do more. And if they can do more, they should. It's just they don't want to be told that they have to steadily increase what they can do or what they try to do, because they know that will push them into a relapse. They should only do the maximum that they can do. But it's true that deconditioning is a problem in any illness. If you're bedbound all the time, it's better to be moving. And if you're bedbound or homebound, if you can only lift your hand 5 times from the bed every other day, that's the movement you should do. If we call that exercise, fine, but let's just call it movement or some activity rather than exercise. So patients, I don't think, in general, are not against movement or not against activity. They're just against being told that they have to do more activity than they know that their bodies can handle. So in Berkeley, this is a consequence. Again, it's used in doctoral epidemiology seminars. It's a perfect case study of really awful science. And Australia seems to be falling behind, because basically it seems still wedded to this CBT-GET paradigm. And it remains the standard of care here, despite evidence that this is really completely bogus. It's still in the guidelines of the Royal College of General Practitioners. And again, as we know, patients can't get NDIS or a pension support, mostly unless they have been shown to go through one of these treatments. And as patients know, they can go through these treatments and get worse, so they don't want to do it. And why should they be forced to? Now, that doesn't mean they should just get it because they claim they're sick. Obviously, you have to have some evidence that shows you're sick. This is not sort of a promoting government giveaways to anybody who walks in their office and says, I'm sick, I have ME, give me money. But they shouldn't be forced to go through treatments that have actually no real evidence base beyond them, besides scientifically questionable studies. Or based on studies that are open label studies with subjective outcomes, which are not accepted in any field of medicine except this kind of field. So these are just my thanks to people, and I want to again emphasize that the patients and advocates who first really were looking at the study are just brilliant. I'm just in awe of them. They are my heroes. Alan's my hero for what he did. It's just amazing. Professor Racaniello, who trusted my reporting, he didn't require it to be vetted legally because he trusted me. And again, if we'd been wrong, we would have been sued. Rhonda, these are my experts who I quoted in my original story, so they were willing to be public about other people's research that they were not involved with, which for scientists is a hard thing to do. I want to say one thing about Berkeley. Some of you know that I have been accused of various things, and that in particular, University of Bristol, where there's a pediatrician that I've criticized her work because it's really egregiously flawed. She's accused me of various things, and then Bristol, her university, decided from their vice chancellor, made a formal complaint to the chancellor at Berkeley to stop me from my critique. Berkeley allowed me to continue, and so I really value that. They didn't seem to indicate that I had done anything wrong because there really isn't anything to point to that I've done wrong. I've just criticized the science and sort of suggested that the people doing the science maybe suffer from some ethical issues and some questionable scientific values. But basically, I've been critiquing the science, and that's my right to do. And Berkeley values that. And again, this study is now used at Berkeley as a case study of bad science. So, and I have Berkeley faculty who sign my open letters. So the Center for Global Public Health is my unit that pays my salary, and that's it. So that's my spiel. I think that's the end. Yes. Okay.